I was sitting in the back of a corporate wellness retreat last Tuesday, watching a room full of exhausted mid-level managers try to build a tower out of marshmallows and spaghetti. At the front of the room stood a man with a blindingly white smile and a badge that read, "Jaffe, Generator of Happiness." He was practically vibrating with positive energy, telling the group that gratitude is a choice and that their quarterly productivity was directly tied to their inner light. It was all very colorful, very Instagrammable. The walls were plastered with neon sticky notes about mindful synergy and emotional flow. But then a woman in the third row raised her hand. She didn't look angry, she just looked tired. She asked a simple, logical question. The new regional quota is double what it was last year, and we're short 3 staff members. How does gratitude help us finish the reports by Friday? The room went dead silent. The happiness generator's smile didn't drop, but it stiffened. It became a mask. He didn't talk about resources, hiring, or logistics. Instead, he tilted his head with performative empathy and asked, "Is it possible that your perspective is what's creating the bottleneck here? Are you choosing to see the obstacle instead of the opportunity?" In that single chilling moment, the happiness in the room stopped being a benefit and started being a performance review. It wasn't about being well, it was about being compliant. We've reached a strange point in modern management where Aristotle's ancient concept of eudaimonia, the good life, built on virtue, reason, and social justice, has been hijacked and rebranded as a corporate KPI. We are being told to smile not because our environment is healthy, but because if we aren't flowing, it's considered a personal character flaw. But what happens when the mandate to be happy becomes a tool to ignore systemic failure? When did the good life stop being about justice and start being about a mandatory grin?
Wow. Yeah, that's a heavy way to start, but it's so incredibly accurate. It's a profound shift we're seeing.
Right, because it felt less like a wellness seminar and more like a, compliance check.
Absolutely. And to understand exactly how we arrived at this point, where this deeply complex human emotion is treated like a measurable, manageable output, we really have to look backward.
Like historically.
Yeah, because this mindset, this absolute need to quantify joy and, weaponize it for productivity, it didn't just pop up with modern HR departments or Silicon Valley wellness apps.
Oh.
No, the philosophical groundwork for quantifying human emotion was actually laid way back in the 19th century, specifically by the utilitarian theorist Jeremy Bentham.
Okay, right, Bentham. He's the guy who fundamentally altered the trajectory of moral philosophy. But, how does a 19th century philosopher's idea turn into the modern nightmare of a happiness generator standing in front of a whiteboard?
Well, Bentham argued that ethical decisions, and honestly the governance of society itself, could be objectively determined. He thought you could just measure the resulting pleasure or pain of any given action.
Like a math equation for morality.
Exactly. Before Bentham, morality was deeply tied to religious virtue, natural law, or these really complex philosophical traditions. But Bentham wanted to strip all of that away.
He just wanted the raw numbers.
Right. He believed that the subjective, highly complex nature of human experience could literally be reduced to a strict mathematical calculus. He called it the philosophic calculus.
Calculus, that just sounds incredibly clinical.
His premise was dangerously simple. He basically said, if an action produces a measurable surplus of pleasure over pain, it is ethically good. And if it produces more pain, it's bad. He wanted to make legislation and morality as exact as mathematics.
Okay, because trying to measure the depths of human consciousness with corporate metrics is like trying to measure the volume of the ocean with a plastic ruler. It inevitably flattens a profound reality into a useless artificial number. You just can't take the entirety of the human condition with all its contradictions and grief and joy and moral struggle and grade it on a scale of 1 to 10. It assumes all pleasure is identical and all pain is identical, just varying in quantity.
What's fascinating here is how the corporate reduction of happiness to a measurable utility completely strips away the context of the human experience, setting the stage for systemic manipulation.
Yeah, manipulation is the right word.
By demanding that happiness be something we can count, Bentham set off this massive chain reaction. Following his work, there was a widespread movement within psychology and economics. Historians and philosophers call it anti-philosophical agnosticism.
Anti-philosophical agnosticism. Wow, okay. That sounds incredibly dense. Can you break down exactly what that means in practice for us?
Yeah. But essentially, figures like the economist William Stanley Jevons, the behaviorist John Watson, and later on, the architects of the Chicago School of Economics, they all desperately wanted their fields to be recognized as hard, objective sciences.
History.
Exactly. And to achieve that level of academic and societal authority, they felt they had to discard the messy, subjective, unobservable realities of internal human experience.
Because you can't put a soul in a beaker.
Right. You can't put a private feeling of fulfillment under a microscope. So they just warped it. They changed happiness from a deeply personal, subjective state of being into an objective, quantifiable phenomenon.
So they stopped asking, how do you feel?
And they started asking, what observable behaviors are you exhibiting that indicate utility?
But because true subjective emotion can't actually be uniformly measured, institutions just substituted proxy metrics, didn't they? They began measuring things they could track and boldly labeled those things happiness. Like, they looked at money, assuming economic consumption was a direct stand-in for utility and joy. If you buy more, you must be happier.
Yeah, the classic consumerist trap.
Or they looked at dopamine levels in the brain, basically reducing joy to a chemical transaction. They analyzed body language, keystrokes, facial expressions.
It's terrifying when you lay it out like that.
They took the profound concept of human well-being and reduced it to a simple utility for consumption and economic efficiency. You aren't a complex being striving for a good life anymore. You're just a data point that either demonstrates the correct proxy behaviors or fails to do so.
And the implications of this quantification are severe. When happiness is defined by these observable, measurable proxies, it lays the precise groundwork for mass surveillance and targeted advertising and psychological profiling. The ultimate goal of this modern happiness industry isn't to ensure that you live a fulfilled life. Let's be real about that.
Not.
The goal is to manipulate emotions to ensure individuals remain politically docile and economically efficient. If state and corporate forces can monitor your emotional state through data inputs like survey responses, biometric feedback, digital communications, they can manipulate your environment to keep you functioning within an acceptable, compliant range.
And they achieve total social control under the guise of benevolence.
Exactly.
Well, that brings us out of the realm of abstract philosophy and directly into the physical reality of the modern workplace. Let's examine what this actually looks like for the people trapped inside the apparatus. Consider a sleek management consultancy in London. I want you to imagine the sensory environment here. The air in the building is thin, entirely recycled through high-end corporate filters, creating this sterile, sealed atmosphere where you can't even open a window to let in the breeze.
The kind of place that feels like a spaceship.
Exactly. And in one of those glass-walled conference rooms, a woman named Sarah is sitting through her third mandatory emotional resilience workshop of the quarter. The facilitator standing before her has this perpetually serene smile, preaching the virtues of internal emotional regulation. But if you look closely at Sarah, her tailored blazer is hiding severe physical deterioration.
Because the physical toll is the part the metrics actively ignore. Sarah's probably working 80-hour weeks.
So at least.
She sleeps maybe 4 hours a night. Her hair is beginning to thin at the temples from the sheer physiological stress. Beneath the polished mahogany conference table, totally out of sight of the facilitator's gaze, she has this nervous habit of picking at her cuticles until they bleed.
Right, she's quite literally tearing herself apart to maintain the facade of professional competence.
And the firm's response to this is what makes it so incredibly sinister.
Because the firm readily provides yoga mats, right? They offer subscriptions to meditation apps, they host these resilience seminars, but they absolutely refuse to hire the additional staff required to make the workload manageable.
They'll do anything but fix the actual problem.
Exactly. And during the vulnerability sharing segment of the workshop, Sarah is asked to speak. She gives a forced rehearsed line about breathing through the pressure.
Which is just a shield.
It masks her deep shame regarding her own silence about the structural rot of the organization. The burden of the firm's predatory billing targets and relentless demands is placed entirely on her ability to generate her own internal happiness.
This is the perfect, terrifying illustration of responsibilization. Have you heard that term?
Responsibilization. I've heard it thrown around, but define it for us in this context.
It's a specific neoliberal process that shifts the burden of care and the responsibility for structural reform away from collective entities like the state or the corporation and places it squarely onto the shoulders of the individual.
So if the system is breaking you, the system isn't held accountable.
Your inability to withstand the system is framed as your personal failing.
The company is essentially saying, the fact that our business model requires you to work 80 hours a week is a fixed law of nature. The fact that you are having a nervous breakdown because of it is a failure of your personal mindfulness practice.
Exactly. which leads directly into the sociological critiques offered by Irving Zola regarding the medicalization of social problems.
Oh, Zola's work is brilliant on this.
Right. Zola pointed out that when we medicalize an issue like burnout, when we treat it as an individual pathology, we locate both the source of the problem and the treatment for the problem entirely within the individual worker.
So the organization gets off scot-free.
Totally. By diagnosing the worker as the entity requiring treatment, whether that treatment is medication, cognitive behavioral therapy, or a mandatory corporate mindfulness workshop, the organization is completely protected from accountability.
Because the structure of the workplace, the impossible quotas, the lack of resources, those are never interrogated. The individual is identified as the site of the pathology.
And then the corporation gets to play the benevolent healer of a sickness it fundamentally caused.
We see this tension so clearly in how global health institutions are grappling with the issue right now. Like, the World Health Organization included burnout in the 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-11.
Which was a massive deal.
Huge. But crucially, the WHO explicitly defines burnout not as a medical disease, but as an occupational phenomenon. It is conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed.
It's about the environment.
Exactly. Sabine Sinsky from the American Medical Association has stated clearly that the focus must be on fixing the workplace, not fixing the worker. Burnout is the result of a mismatch between workloads and resources. It's not a sudden, mysterious evaporation of your emotional resilience. It's a mathematical reality of having more tasks than hours and fewer resources than required.
If the medical and psychological communities explicitly recognize that burnout is an occupational and environmental failure, why do corporate solutions consistently focus on the individual?
Actually, but what's the psychological angle here?
The answer lies in the psychological research of Sabine Sonnentag. She identified what she calls the recovery paradox.
The recovery paradox.
Yeah, her research demonstrates a cruel biological reality. Individuals are biologically and psychologically least able to recover from work precisely when their job stressors are at their highest.
Wait, explain the mechanism behind that, because you'd think, why can't someone just go home after a terrible 80-hour week and engage in intense self-care?
Because the cognitive and physiological systems required to engage in restorative activities are the exact systems depleted by chronic stress. Right. When you are under intense chronic stress, your executive function is compromised. Your body is flooded with stress hormones. The active pursuit of self-care, like going to the gym, cooking a healthy meal, engaging in a complex hobby that requires energy, planning, and motivation.
And when your job extracts all of that from you, you're left with nothing.
Nothing. Therefore, when a corporation prescribes self-care activities to an exhausted workforce without fundamentally reducing the stressors causing the exhaustion, they are perpetuating a toxic cycle.
They're demanding that the worker fix a problem they didn't create, using energy they no longer possess.
It is a literal form of institutional gaslighting.
Well, to understand how corporations justify this institutional gaslighting, we really have to look at the underlying philosophical definitions of happiness that they are actively exploiting. We're dealing with two entirely different traditions of thought that have been developing for thousands of years.
Yeah, let's get into the philosophy.
First, there is the Hedonic tradition, championed by philosophers like Aristippus, Epicurus, and later Jeremy Bentham, what we talked about. The Hedonic tradition equates well-being with positive emotional states, the satisfaction of immediate desires, and the absence of pain.
Which is how most people casually define happiness today.
Right. And in the realm of modern psychology, this is quantified as subjective well-being, or SWB. SWB is essentially a combination of experiencing positive affect, feeling good in the moment, and reporting general life satisfaction.
But in stark contrast stands the Eudaimonic tradition. This one is rooted deeply in Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics.
Aristotle was not a fan of the hedonic approach, was he?
Aristotle fundamentally rejected the pursuit of pleasure for pleasure's sake. He viewed the hedonic pursuit as fit only for grazing animals, not for complex, rational human beings.
Oh.
Yeah, he did mince words. For Aristotle, eudaimonia is about living a life of contemplation, virtue, and actualizing your inherent potential. It's about living true to your daemon, the highest, most divine aspect of your nature.
And this isn't just about feeling good.
Crucially, no. The eudaimonic approach is an objective approach to a life well lived. It does not prioritize fleeting good feelings. In fact, true eudaimonia often requires intense effort, facing significant challenges, and the rigorous pursuit of complex long-term goals that might be entirely devoid of immediate pleasure.
Interesting. If we contrast these two concepts, hedonia is the fleeting warmth of eating a sugar-coated donut. It feels good in the moment, your brain gets a spike of dopamine, it satisfies a craving, but it provides no lasting substance. In an hour, you're gonna crash.
Exactly.
But eudaimonia is the callous-inducing long-term labor of planting an orchard so the whole community can eat for decades. It involves sweat, frustration, blisters on your hands, and waiting years to see the results. But the outcome is objectively valuable and deeply rooted in virtue. And the thing is, corporations have recognized the immense productive power of the orchard, but they want to harvest it while only feeding you the donut. They want the output of eudaimonia, but they only want to provide the cheap, quick interventions of hedonia.
That corporate hijacking of eudaimonia is perhaps the most insidious development in modern human resources. Truly. They aren't just asking you to be productive anymore. They are demanding that you find your ultimate spiritual and moral fulfillment in generating revenue for shareholders.
Modern psychological models actually attempt to integrate both of these traditions into a comprehensive concept termed flourishing, right?
Alan Waterman's PAQ research demonstrates the distinct characteristics of each tradition in practice. He showed that eudaimonic activities involve a high balance of challenge and skill. They require intense effort, and they often result in a state of flow or deep absorption.
That's when you're so challenged by a meaningful task that you lose your sense of self.
Right. Hedonic activities, on the other hand, involve relaxation, losing track of time, and temporarily forgetting your problems. Sitting on the couch watching television is hedonic. Writing a complex novel that frustrates you to tears but fulfills your sense of purpose is eudaimonic.
Furthermore, research by Schuler and Seligman into orientations to happiness reveals that a life rich in meaning, engagement, and pleasure yields the highest overall well-being. You kind of need the hedonic rest to sustain the eudaimonic effort.
Yes, but they noted a critical distinction. Meaning and engagement, the eudaimonic components, correlate much higher with actual educational and occupational achievement than the mere pursuit of pleasure. It is the pursuit of meaning that builds a robust, resilient life, not the avoidance of pain.
So let's look at a practical, devastating example of this distortion in the corporate world. Imagine a man named Elias walking the sterile, glass-walled corridors of a Frankfurt fintech firm. On Elias's monitor sits a happiness dashboard.
The dashboards.
Right. It's a specialized software program displaying his team's aggregate mood as a pulsing green orb. The dashboard demands positivity. The algorithm flags anything else as an anomaly requiring intervention.
But the reality of Elias's environment is vastly different from that glowing green orb, isn't it?
Different. He witnesses the physical reality of his team every day. He sees his lead developer, Clara. She has visible physical tremors in her hands, brought on by the adrenaline and sleep deprivation of impossible software sprint deadlines.
Physical tremors.
Yes. The air in the office smells permanently of stale coffee, a lingering byproduct of endless mandated overtime. He frequently finds Clara weeping quietly in the concrete stairwell, which is the only place in the building without glass walls, just to avoid the panopticon of the open plan office.
So what happens when Elias attempts to do the virtuous Aristotelian thing?
Well, he gathers the data, documents the impossible hours, and raises the issue of severe understaffing with executive management. He expects a logistical discussion about resource allocation.
But that's not what he gets.
No, instead, management accuses him of lacking vibrational leadership.
Vibrational leadership. That is peak corporate jargon.
Sure, they do not look at his data. They hand him a presentation deck on eudaimonic reframing.
Which is a gross, deliberate perversion of ancient philosophy.
The presentation suggests to Elias that the structural struggle, the physical tremors, the weeping in the stairwell, is simply a lack of the correct perspective.
It frames the suffering of his team not as a failure of management to provide resources, but as a failure of the team to actualize their potential through struggle.
It's weaponized stoicism. It uses the language of philosophy to crush legitimate dissent.
So what does Elias do?
Well, to protect his team from further harassment by corporate wellness consultants, who would only add more mandatory seminars to their overwhelming workload, Elias does the only thing he can do. He logs into the system and manually inflates the team's happiness score on the dashboard to 88%.
He lies to the machine.
He inputs a lie. It's a lie that sits like a cold stone in his stomach. He is sacrificing his own moral integrity to shield his team from a weaponized metric. He is protecting them from the very system claiming to foster their well-being.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what Elias experienced in that Frankfurt office is the direct, violent collision of two fundamentally opposed paradigms of human organization.
The Hobbesian versus the Aristotelian.
Exactly. The modern corporate environment is largely built on a Hobbesian paradigm of human relations. Thomas Hobbes viewed the natural state of humanity as a war of all against all.
A very bleak outlook.
This view assumes that interactions are inherently driven by egoism, resulting in zero-sum games where there are distinct winners and losers. In this paradigm, the corporation exists to extract maximum surplus value from the worker, and the worker attempts to extract maximum compensation from minimum effort.
But Aristotle's paradigm is different.
Completely different. It's based on reciprocity and the concept of the polis, the community where individuals work together organically for mutual flourishing. The polis is a shared endeavor, not an extractive machine.
But modern HR practices attempt to drape the harsh, extractive Hobbesian reality in warm Aristotelian language everywhere.
Oh, everywhere.
Look at data-driven algorithms for culture fit, which basically determine if you have the right personality to be exploited. Look at mandatory Friday social gatherings, which just extend the workday under the guise of friendship.
Or the endless array of workplace perks.
Right. Ping pong tables, on-site dry cleaning, free snacks. We must critically ask whether these initiatives are genuinely benevolent attempts to build a modern polis, or if they're simply an evolution of Hobbesian exploitation aimed solely at extracting surplus value by keeping workers docile, distracted, and physically tethered to the office.
If you never have to leave the building to get your dry cleaning or your dinner, you never stop working. We can contextualize this illusion of benevolence by looking historically at Robert Owen's New Lanark Mills in the 19th century.
Robert Owen, the utopian industrialist.
Right. He was an early social utopian who implemented massive social reforms in his cotton mills. He radically reduced working hours, abolished child labor under a certain age, and built unprecedented community structures, schools, and sanitation facilities for his mill workers.
And people praised him for it.
Oh, it was widely praised across Europe as a miracle of benevolent capitalism. Yet historians and economists note that the ultimate result of these reforms was a massive increase in the productivity, efficiency, and profitability of the mills.
Because healthier workers work harder.
Exactly. The workforce was healthier and less prone to turnover, which meant the machines ran more smoothly. The reforms, while materially beneficial to the workers, fundamentally served the bottom line. They were an optimization strategy masquerading as pure philanthropy.
And when a modern corporation uses the language of eudaimonia, virtue, and family as an internal branding tool, it actively neutralizes legitimate grievances.
That's the real danger.
If the company is branded not as an employer exchanging money for labor, but as a vehicle for your personal self-actualization, then your structural exhaustion or burnout is no longer a labor dispute.
It can't be addressed through collective bargaining or demanding better hours.
No. It becomes your individual failure to flourish within a system the corporation has already declared to be perfect. The corporation immunizes itself against critique by claiming to be the arbiter of the good life.
This brings us to a critical juncture, how virtues themselves are being converted into metrics, and the devastating reality of what that does to actual meaningful work.
Let's look at another scenario to ground this time with Mark, an HR director based in Lyon. Mark is sitting in his meticulously designed office, looking out the window into the driving rain. On his high-resolution screen sits an elegant, moral, flourishing spreadsheet.
The spreadsheets are always elegant.
And this spreadsheet is the culmination of months of data collection. It is filled with Likert scales, 360-degree engagement scores, and algorithmic sentiment analysis of employee emails and instant messages.
Reading between the lines of every message.
According to the spreadsheet, a logistics coordinator named Jean has been flagged by the system as a happiness liability.
A happiness liability.
Jean consistently gives neutral, middle-of-the-road responses on surveys. He does not use exclamation points in his emails, and he absolutely refuses to attend mandatory fun Fridays at the local pub. The algorithm has determined Jean is a drag on the corporate culture.
But the metrics are entirely blind to the complex reality of Jean's character. Jean is not a cheerleader. He is a practitioner of quiet diligence. He's the only person on the logistics floor who rigidly and consistently enforces safety protocols, checking the harnesses, verifying the weight limits, protecting his colleagues from severe physical injury in a high-risk environment.
And as Mark looks out the window of his warm office, he watches Jean out in the pouring rain, soaked to the bone. Jean is helping a stressed delivery driver fix a broken wooden pallet so the driver won't be penalized by the corporate supply chain algorithm.
That act, right there in the rain, is a genuine demonstration of Aristotelian practical wisdom, or phronesis, and civic virtue.
It is the real polis in action. Jean is prioritizing the well-being of a fellow worker over his own comfort.
Yet, because the software cannot measure quiet virtue.
Because it cannot quantify a repaired pallet in the rain.
And because it only values performative enthusiasm and digital compliance, Mark is faced with a terrifying corporate reality.
He realizes he is expected to manage Jean out of the company. He must fire a genuinely good man to boost the department's aggregate happiness score. The metrics demand a sacrifice of substance for the sake of appearance.
The metrics sanitize the workplace of any dissenting honesty or quiet, unglamorous diligence. They force Mark to penalize genuine virtue in favor of measurable compliance, leaving Mark himself with a profound, unproductive sadness.
It's a moral injury caused by enforcing a system he knows is fundamentally unjust. Measuring true virtue with a corporate engagement survey is like using a metal detector to find a heartbeat.
A metal detector for a heartbeat.
It fundamentally misunderstands the substance it is looking for. It reduces the depth of human morality, courage, and compassion to an exchange value. You are taking something sacred and rendering it transactional.
Aristotle made a critical distinction regarding the polis, which in this context we can apply to the organization or the corporation. He rigorously differentiated between use value and exchange value.
Break those down for us.
Well, use value relates to the actual intrinsic quality and purpose of a thing. A shoe's use value is its ability to protect your foot. Exchange value relates to money, trade, and abstract metrics. What can you sell the shoe for? When a corporation values an employee only by their exchange value, their metric score on a dashboard, their visible cheerfulness, they destroy the use value of their actual character. They destroy the intrinsic worth of a person like Jean.
Aristotle also introduced the concept of the golden mean and distributive justice. In a just polis, resources, roles, and rewards should be allocated based on who can make the greatest genuine contribution to the good of the community.
He famously used the example of flutes, right?
Yes. The best flutes should not go to the richest citizens or the most handsome or the most cheerful. The best flutes should go to the best flute players because that fulfills the purpose of the flute and benefits the community with beautiful music.
Sense.
In the modern corporate equivalent, resources, promotions, and job security should go to those demonstrating actual competence and practical wisdom, like Jean in the rain.
But instead, they are arbitrarily assigned based on sentiment analysis and compliance with management by objectives or MBOs.
MBOs, which attempt to quantify subjective moral traits and turn them into targets.
The 20th century philosopher Martin Buber provides a vital lens to understand the psychological and spiritual damage this systemic codification causes. Buber profoundly described two distinct types of human relationships.
I-it and I-thou. Right.
The first is the I-it relationship. In this mode, you experience others as objects to be utilized, measured, categorized, and manipulated for your own ends. The other person is merely a means to an end.
And the second?
The second is the I-thou relationship, where you encounter the entirety of the other person in a genuine human way, recognizing their inherent dignity and subjecthood without trying to extract anything from them.
And corporate metrics inherently force an I-it relationship between management and employees.
And devastatingly, even between peers. When your colleague is viewed as a variable affecting your team's aggregate happiness score, when their bad day threatens your quarterly bonus, genuine professional civility and positive organizing are destroyed.
You are no longer interacting with a complex human being experiencing a difficult life. You are managing a metric.
And the tragic irony of this entire apparatus is that true eudaimonia is not just a philosophical concept debated by men in togas.
No, it is a hard biological reality. You cannot fake it, and your body knows the difference between a mandated corporate smile and genuine self-realization.
Your cells literally know when you are lying.
Carol Reff's groundbreaking Midas study, the Midlife in the United States study, explicitly outlined the 6 dimensions of actual biologically verifiable psychological well-being. Those dimensions are autonomy, environmental mastery, personal growth, positive relations with others, purpose in life, and self-acceptance. Notice that enforced cheerfulness is not on that list. Synergistic flow is not on that list.
The biological correlates of genuine eudaimonia, when those 6 dimensions are actually met, are profound. But they only manifest when that well-being is actually supported by the material environment, not faked for a dashboard.
The research is incredibly clear on this.
When an individual experiences high eudaimonic well-being, rooted in genuine autonomy and mastery over their work, they exhibit significantly lower levels of interleukin-6, or IL-6.
And IL-6 is an inflammatory marker, right?
It's a key inflammatory marker linked to cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, and osteoporosis. They also show better neuroendocrine regulation, specifically characterized by lower daily cortisol output, meaning their baseline stress response is calm and regulated.
And their sleep improves.
Drastically. Their sleep architecture physically improves, showing higher REM efficiency. Over the long term, high genuine eudaimonia is linked to a significantly reduced risk of Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. Genuine fulfillment protects the brain.
But those biological benefits cannot be engineered in a vacuum of exploitation. This introduces the crucial concept of structural lag.
Structural lag.
It's the glaring reality that modern workplaces, corporate structures, and societal institutions lag far behind the developmental, psychological, and biological needs of human beings. True self-realization is highly dependent on socioeconomic status, education, and the equitable allocation of resources.
You can't out-mindset systemic poverty or exhaustion.
You cannot mandate that an employee achieve environmental mastery when you refuse to give them the staff, the budget, or the authority to actually master their environment. You are asking them to build a house without bricks and then penalizing them when they fail to feel fulfilled by the process.
Aristotle himself recognized this reality over 2 millennia ago. He was remarkably pragmatic about it. He stated clearly that eudaimonia requires specific material conditions.
You can't just think your way into flourishing.
No, you need health, you need adequate food, you need secure shelter. And crucially, Aristotle argued you need leisure time entirely free from labor, meant for contemplation, civic participation, and rest.
Virtue and flourishing cannot manifest when an individual is trapped in a state of constant survival or systemic exploitation.
Biological resilience is severely, sometimes permanently compromised when individuals are forced to feign happiness and expend vital cognitive energy on performative compliance in a high-stress, low-resource environment. True flourishing requires systemic scaffolding. It requires an environment that actually supports the biological and psychological reality of the human organism.
The evolution of happiness from an ancient, rigorous philosophical pursuit of virtue into a weaponized, surveilled corporate metric represents a fundamental crisis in how we define work, human dignity, and value itself. We have traced how 19th century utilitarian metrics warped the subjective human experience into a calculus of control. We have seen how neoliberal responsibilization shifted the crushing burden of systemic failure directly onto the shoulders of the exhausted individual. And we have witnessed how the rich, challenging concept of Aristotelian eudaimonia has been flattened, sanitized, and corrupted into a dashboard indicator meant to enforce docility. Forcing positive emotions without addressing the undeniable root causes of workplace suffering, chronic understaffing, impossible operational targets, and a total lack of genuine autonomy does not create a healthy culture. It systematically destroys both the mental and physical health of the workforce.
True human flourishing cannot be engineered from the top down via algorithmic dashboards or mandated resilience workshops. It is an organic outcome of justice, equitable resources, and the unaudited freedom to experience genuine human emotion, including justified discontent.